This tutorial will explain the rule of arrow in and some other new concepts that we need to understand once we start using the rule of arrow in. So the first new concept that we're going to need to talk about is the idea of a provisional assumption. So up until now, we've just been working with assumptions or premises. With assumptions, we're assuming that the assumptions are true, and we're seeing what follows from that. With provisional assumptions, which we will abbreviate as PA, we are asking, what if this statement, whatever it is that we're assuming is a PA, what if this statement is true? And then we're seeing what follows from that. This is a subtle but very important difference. With assumptions, we're fine with the conclusion depending on these assumptions because these are the things that we are given as true for the sake of argument. And thus, if another statement follows from these assumptions using one of the rules that we have, then we can also be confident that the conclusion is true as well, given the truth of our starting premises. However, this is not the case with provisional assumptions, because the provisional assumption is not something that we're given at the start of the proof. It's just something that at some point within the proof we're asking, well, what if this PA is true? Thus, we're going to need to be careful with the provisional assumptions, because we're fine with the conclusion depending on our original assumptions that we are given as true, but we don't want our conclusion to depend on any of these provisional assumptions. So we're going to need a mechanism to track what depends on what as we work through our derivation, so that we can make sure at the end of the day, at our final conclusion, that the final conclusion does not depend on a provisional assumption, that it only depends on our starting assumptions. So this is the big rule. A proof, the final line of a proof cannot depend on a provisional assumption. So the ADC column, which stands for Assumption Dependence Column, will be the mechanism by which we will trace what depends on what. We'll keep track of the dependencies as we work through the proof. Okay, so the rule of arrow in looks like this. So suppose we want to derive some conditional statement. And this is a conditional statement that we don't have in our proof already. It's not like we can extract it from the premises. So we need to build it. So we build it using the rule of arrow in. So arrow in puts an arrow into a statement. And the way we do it is, so we want to derive P arrow Q. So we start out by saying, well, what if P is true? So we make a provisional assumption of P. And if, through a series of steps, P leads us to Q, which is the consequent of the conditional we are trying to derive, then we can say, aha, well, if P is true, then so is Q. So if P, then Q. Basically, the way this works is that the only thing we're taking away from this proof is the conclusion of P arrow Q. That's the thing that matters at the end of the day. And we can go on and use that in our proof, or maybe it's our final conclusion. And the idea, we know this is valid because, well, we start out by saying, well, what if P is true? And if Q follows as true from this assumption of P being true, then we know that the statement P arrow Q is also true. And so that statement of P arrow Q, that's what we take away from this whole proof, this whole part of the proof. And the only thing that we need to add to this picture is that we need to draw a box we put this whole subproof, the arrow in subproof, inside a box. And the box will start with the provisional assumption we made for the purposes of an arrow in proof, and it will end just below the consequent of the conditional that we're trying to derive by P arrow Q. The other thing that we will need to add is as soon as we do a provisional assumption, we're going to need an ADC column for our proof. So any proof that includes a provisional assumption requires an assumption dependence column. Any proof that does not have a provisional assumption in it doesn't need an assumption dependence column. You could still do it, but you don't need to. Because it's only when we get the provisional assumptions in that we're worried that the final line in our proof might depend on a provisional assumption, and that's what the ADC column helps us keep track, helps us make sure that that's not the case. Okay, so in your in the lecture slides for last class, you will find all of the rules for the assumption dependence column. So you might want to stop this video right here for a second, go get that PowerPoint, and open it up while I talk through the assumption dependence column with an example, because it's easier to understand how it works if you sort of see it in action. So that's what I'm going to show you next. Let's get rid of all of this stuff so we can start fresh. Okay, so let's suppose we have the argument P arrow Q is one of the premises, and Q arrow R is another premise, and then finally R arrow S is the last premise. And what we're trying to prove is the statement P arrow S. Okay, so we're trying to prove our conclusion is P arrow S. So this is not a conditional that we have up there in our premises. We can't extract it from anywhere. So we need to build it. So we're going to need to build it using the rule of arrow in. So we'll start out that arrow in proof by assuming the antecedent of the conditional we're trying to derive. So assume P. So that's a provisional assumption. And we're going to try to get to S. When we get to S, we can say, aha, P arrow S by arrow in. And I'm going to put all of this in a box right now, because I know that's where the box is going to go. And then I can just write everything else inside the box as I go along. Okay, so now as soon as we've made a provisional assumption in our proof, we need an assumption dependence column. So I'm going to talk through the rules for the assumption dependence column. So the first rule is that assumptions and provisional assumptions depend on themselves. This makes sense because what else would they depend on? So 1 is an assumption, so it depends on itself, so we write 1. Likewise, 2 is an assumption, so we write a 2 next to that premise. Line 3 is an assumption, so it depends on itself, so we write a 3. And then finally, line 4 is a provisional assumption, so it's also going to depend on itself, so we write a 4 in the assumption dependence column. All right, let's start the derivation. So next, I'm going to derive Q, and that's from 1, 4, arrow out. Okay, so now we're going to introduce a new rule for the assumption dependence column, and this is called the standard rule. And for now, the standard rule will apply to lines justified by the rules arrow out, and in. We'll save how to deal with arrow in for the next rule. Okay, so what the standard rule says is that lines justified by the rules of arrow out, and in will depend on whatever their justifying lines depend on. I'll repeat that. Lines justified by arrow out, and in will depend upon whatever their justifying lines depend on. So we look at the justifying lines, that's 1 and 4. So then we look at line 1. Well, line 1 depends on 1, so line 5 will depend on 1. And then the other justifying line is line 4, so line 4 depends on 4. So we write 1, 4. And notice I write 1, 4. Don't write just 1, 4, because then it'll look like 14, which will be wrong and confusing, because I don't think we're going to have 14 lines here. And we certainly don't have 14 lines yet. So that would make no sense to have a 14. Now, just want to go over this one more time, because if you look at this, you might think, oh, so a line justified by arrow out, that's going to depend on the justifying lines that are used. So 1 and 4, 1 and 4. And that's not the case. You'll see an example of how it works out differently in the next derivation. It depends on whatever the justifying lines depend on. They happen to match because the justifying lines in this case are all either assumptions or provisional assumptions. However, in our next derivation, line 6, so let's derive r, and that's by 2, 5, arrow out. And so we look again, so line 6 is going to depend upon whatever these justifying lines depend on. So it's going to depend on what 2 depends on and what 5 depends on. So we look, 2 depends on 2, so we write a 2. And then 5 depends on 1 and 4, so we write a 1 and a 4, not a 5. So you can see how it depends on what the justifying lines depend on, not on the justifying lines itself. And so now you can see that the only numbers, I think you can see now developing that the only numbers that are going to appear in the assumption dependence column are numbers that correspond to either assumptions or to provisional assumptions. So if you ever see a number in your assumption dependence column that doesn't correspond to an assumption or a provisional assumption, you should know that you've done something wrong, and you should go back and double check and fix it. Okay, and then finally now we can get S on line 7. We can get S by 3, 6, arrow out. So again, we look at line 3, we see what it depends on. It depends on 3. Then we look at line 6 and we see what it depends on. It depends on 1, 2, and 4. So we write 1, 2, 3, 4. Now you notice I was writing them in the numbers in order. That part doesn't matter. So if you had written 3, 1, 2, 4, that would be totally fine. You just need to make sure all the numbers that should be there are there. Okay, now we're in a position to do our arrow in step, because we were able to get from the assumption of P to the consequent of the conditional we wanted to derive, S, and so we can say, aha, if P, then S. And the justification will be 4 through 7, arrow in. So that's how we do the justification. Notice that it's a dash, not a comma. Because it's not just lines 4 and 7 that justify this arrow in step. It's all the lines 4 through 7 that justify saying we can get P arrow S by arrow in. Okay, so now we need to talk about the arrow in rule for the assumption dependence column. So what the arrow in rule says is that a line justified by arrow in depends upon whatever the consequent line depends on. So that's line 7. So that line 7 depends on 1, 2, 3, and 4. Except for the line that contains the provisional assumption that is the antecedent of the conditional that you're deriving. So except for line 4. So we see that this last line only depends on lines 1, 2, and 3. We check 1, 2, and 3 are all assumptions, so that's perfect. We haven't broken the big rule. Our final conclusion does not depend on a provisional assumption. So that concludes how the rule of arrow in works, how to do the assumption dependence column, what provisional assumptions are all about. So we will also be practicing this a bunch next class before going on to the next rule. So you'll get to see it in action a few more times and practice with it before you have to do it as homework. But I wanted to do this tutorial to make sure everybody was on the same page when we got to class on Tuesday.